we'll have a pause and just look at what's been coming in through the chat room and see where we go.
So, yeah, sorry, I'm just getting up to speed on the PowerPoint, but if you can see at the bottom of the approach slide that's on the screen now, there's a link that should be live. I hope it is, and it says the research can be read here. Throughout each of the slides, there's a link at the bottom to the relevant page of the website, so you can read more deeply around all of the research. So first up is barriers.
Okay, and we wanted to talk first of all about technology, which obviously that is key to what's been happening in the last 15 years in this area. And obviously technology is a huge enabler. There's lots of very clear and important things that could be said about it. We want to concentrate on three somewhat less obvious factors which impact on online health communities. And the first of those is that if you think about the technology that the NHS invests in, so over Connecting for Health, it invested £1 billion a year in its IT. How much were citizens investing at that time? How much do we invest in our own IT? And if you think that we invest about £400 per household, which is not very much for all our broadband, our mobiles, our PCs, our iPads, £400 per household, you get to £10 billion a year. So we as citizens are investing at 10 times the rate of all other organisations, be they commercial or the NHS. And that fundamentally is a really significant driver about what's happening in this field. Because of that, hierarchical power is collapsing. It's becoming harder and harder to exert hierarchical power, and you can see that right across society in terms of social media, in terms of news media, in terms of disruptive industries like Uber, but it's also happening in health. And one of the ways it's happening in health is through context collapse, that where in the past, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when I started practicing medicine, it was very clear who you were in the doctor role, and nobody really could see anything about the rest of your personality, your role. Now it's really obvious from social media what your doctor is doing, what his or her interests are, what your cardiologist, you can find their Facebook pages and so on. And this presents a whole area of what's termed within the literature of context collapse, where the context by which we decide and guide our social interactions is suddenly much more confusing. You don't have the real life face-to-face signals, but also you can see multiple different aspects of the people that you're interacting as personalities. And we know that, of course, in everyday life, in our own out-of-work personas, when we're on Facebook, when we're on Twitter, but it's really confusing when you're in a health context. And the third bit of this, so the first is that citizens are getting the technical power much faster than organizations, and that is disabling hierarchical power. The second is that within organizations and as a patient, it's really complicated to navigate this world. And the last bit of this, which is also really important, is that medicine has traditionally been structured as a parent-child dynamic. And that's obviously really important and really necessary when you're ill and when you're feeling vulnerable. But the technology of the web is very much peer-to-peer, very much autonomous units interacting with each other, and it proposes all the time, in all the systems that it touches, not just health, it proposes adult-adult relationships. And again, you can see that on Twitter, for example, it's very, there's much less hierarchical distance between people. People interact, not necessarily in an adult way, but as adults to adults rather than as parents to child. And that change is fundamental to why clinicians, we think, find it so hard to interact with online health communities. They're used to, they need, and speaking as an ex-clinician, I think I certainly needed, to have the assurance that I knew what was going on, I had the power, I was a parent figure. And the online world continually proposes an adult-adult relationship. So that's the first kind of set of barriers that has to do with technology disrupting both the physical way we communicate, which we're all very familiar with, but also much deeper psychodynamic processes about how medicine and healthcare have traditionally been carried out and which are much harder to do in this online world.
Okay. Excuse me. So next up, the actual title of this barrier we suggested was Finance and Business Models Constrain. So the very nature of the finance and business models that are driving online activity are a fundamental constraint on the way in which online health communities can develop. So Paul talks about the exponential growth of digital technology between users and the NHS. So what you effectively have is an exponential increase, an exponential curve in terms of uptake and use of technology, and an exponential decrease in cost, meaning that this technology is increasingly available to the likes of individuals over and above organizations. At the same time, the business models that drive online activity or rather the investors and the money that goes into online activity is seeking an exponential increase in return. But the reality is that as power shifts from organizations, be it investors or healthcare organizations, private sector or public, to individuals, the return, that exponential return, is going to the individual and leaving the organization, be it investor or public sector, behind. So what you have is a fundamental dichotomy where the money that's needed to get going in online health communities is seeking a return that it simply cannot get in those worlds. The other thing that's very interesting to think about within the context of finance and business models is the concept of trying to figure out the balance between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is something that I do for the love of it. Extrinsic motivation is something I do for the reward. And what having one of these in my pocket means is that I can do pretty much anything whenever I want, according to what intrinsically motivates me. As a consequence, activities which deliver some kind of extrinsic reward, are falling behind activities that deliver some kind of intrinsic reward. And as a consequence, there's another reason why there's a very, there's a decreasing potential for the investment that's needed into online health communities to realize the return that is expected. So finance and business models fundamentally constrain the development of online health communities is what we found.
And in terms of that triangle, if you're running one of these platforms, you are continually trying to manage this unstable trilemma between trust, which is very much around internal motivation, around the values that you're trying to promote, and about money. And that money, as Ben's talking about, if it's from a venture capitalist who we talk to, several of them, they're looking for a very clear return, which immediately impacts on trust. People are thinking, well, who's getting the money here? What's going to happen if I'm giving my time, my experience as a patient for free? How does this all work? So when I was running Patient Opinion, managing that trilemma between money, values, and trust was a continual, difficult and unstable thing you were trying to satisfy. I mean, it's doable, but it's not easy, and it's certainly not the model that you find in Shoreditch and the kind of investment models that venture capitalists are looking for.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, who's up next?
Me, I think.
That's you, isn't it? Objective truth rules.
So this is obviously within the health, this is a truism almost, that the medical model and evidence-based stuff rules the world. But in social media, of course, social media's run on anecdote, gossip, anxiety, truth-telling, sharing, a very different set of ways of knowing the world. And these two are continually in conflict often, and you can see it. People were talking about, when we talked about people who are running, patients who are running their own online groups, how difficult it was for them to manage online forums where somebody would be violently in favor of, say, crystal therapy for their condition, and at the same time others were saying, well, it's really important, it's all got to be evidence-based. And and that's one example, but also how do you handle gossip about a particular provider, or is that representative or not, and how do we make judgments about our local hospital if we read something on social media about it. So there's different ways of viewing the truth here that aren't easy to reconcile, and that's a significant barrier to what's going on. So scale. Scale, when we came to this, the original title of our research was called Massive Open Online Disease-Orientated Communities.
It was a mouthful.
MOODOCs, it was modelled on MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses. We thought maybe something like MOOCs was going to happen in health. And clearly there are disease-orientated communities, and they are relatively open, and they are relatively online. But what we found over and over again is that they aren't massive. And people were saying what we want is a Facebook for health. We want something that's going to go to scale. Just as Ben was saying, the investors were particularly likely to say this.
Well, it's usually TripAdvisor or Uber for health.
Yeah, that's what people ask.
Yeah.
So in our conversations with people, they led us to eventually understand that actually within health, and this may be true of other online communities, but certainly within health, there are very strong forces which are promoting the fragmentation of those communities and the splitting of those communities. And those forces are things like, that I want an online community that covers both renal failure and rheumatoid arthritis, or this is getting too big, I'm not going to participate anymore, or I've been doing this for 3 months and I'm ill again, so I'm going to withdraw. So there's all sorts of personal reasons that where the energy rises and falls in health communities. And of course, there's really big differences amongst diseases. If you take a community focused on a palliative care disease like motor neuron disease, that's got a very different set of requirements in terms of governance, in terms of the kind of psychodynamics that are going on, in terms of the disease trajectory, to one that's, say, focused on Down syndrome. And all these things prevent big scaling, the classic kind of logarithmic scaling that investors are looking for, and indeed people like me when I started Patient Opinion were looking for. And it's great. So scale is a bug, not a feature for online health communities. Scale is something that investors and patient organisations and NHS England, in terms of all sorts of things like Care Connect, are looking for, but actually it's a bug. It isn't a feature. People need the ability to split their communities, to let them die, for them to fork, if these things really deliver intimacy and genuine sharing that they're capable of. So one of the key questions we came to is how we thought about this as something we call clustered scaling. So in each of the bubbles you can see there is a given community. That might be a disease community, or it might be a community focused around a particular hospital, or it might be a research community or whatever. But the dynamics within each of those bubbles are very different. They're particular to that community. And you can have two communities. There are lots of communities, for instance, that talk about big diseases like diabetes, and they'll have very different dynamics, even within the same disease community, as to what's causing them to scale or not. So as a platform manager, as somebody looking at these online communities, it's really important to recognize that this is happening, that it's unlikely in our view that you're ever going to get a massive unicorn single type Facebook or TripAdvisor for health, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
So I'm just going to pick up on something that Mark said, quoting John Popham. Every time you ask a freelancer to do something for free, a unicorn breaks its leg and spears a kitten in the eye with its horn as it falls. John Popham, love him. In this context, I'm not sure in that context, but in the context we're talking about, a unicorn is $1 billion valuation, minimum $1 billion valuation tech company. So everybody in the tech world is looking for that unicorn. So I would paraphrase that quote from John, and I'd say something like, every time an engaged patient logs into an online health community, a unicorn breaks its leg and spears a clinician in the eye.
Okay.
Something like that would be a comedic paraphrase. I'd add one other point in on this slide, if that's all right, which is Robin Dunbar. So if anybody is in the mood, if they don't know Dunbar's number, go onto Wikipedia and just Google Dunbar's number. He's an anthropologist and psychologist who worked in '91 to look at meaningful group size, and he identified that the maximum meaningful group size where we can cognitively hold meaningful relationships is 150. He issued a paper at the beginning of this year looking at this number and testing it within the context of online communities, and found that that number stayed the same. But more importantly, from our point of view, there are smaller groups. He called an average of 15 people create your sympathy network, and an average of 5 people create your intimacy network. So what we found again and again were very small groups of people working intimately together to support each other. A group of type 1 diabetes patients on a closed Facebook group, for instance. Sympathy groups slightly bigger, providing a close support but not that intimate level, and then communities up to about 150, where some level of meaningful engagement was going on.
You mean communities with 150 active participants?
Yes.
So they may have many more watchers and lurkers, so that the actual size of Facebook communities on, say, Atom UK is something like 30 or 40,000, but the number of active participants is very much less at any one time, and that's probably something to do with Dunbar's number of us being, as humans, limited to actually only being able to cope with 150 people.
Yeah. That's enough on scales. On governance, as the slide said, there's a deep asymmetry with the demands of the NHS and demands on patients. So, you know, in governance terms, it's really tough, or governance is really tough for the NHS. For us lot, it's a doddle. You know, you put your Fitbit on and it tells you what's going on. Procurement is a nightmare, but for us, we just, you know, we go out and shop Amazon or the Apple Store. And regulation is painful for the NHS, but for us, we just tick the terms and conditions. And as a consequence, what we have is this bizarre, contradictory world of online health communities that are so lightly governed that they can just get on and make sense of the world, trying to interact with a system, the NHS system, which is so heavily governed that never the twain shall meet. It reminds me of the book, a 1990-something book, The Cathedral and the Marketplace.
And the Bazaar.
Or the Bazaar, that's it. That's it in a nutshell, really, in terms of governance. Never the twain shall meet.
And I think that if you take that those asymmetries between the NHS organisation and the citizen, and add to it the fact that citizens are effectively investing at 10 times the rate in their tech that the NHS is, you can see why we should be placing our bets on the citizen, on the patient side of this equation, and not on the NHS organisation, commercial side of the organisation. It's not because the NHS is particularly stupid. It isn't. It's because big hierarchical organisations that have to deliver tightly coupled systems where it really matters they get it right are going to get much further behind the wave of citizen innovation that is happening.
So I'm just going to go back one slide and answer Tim Mustall's point. Is there an average percentage or ratio to active to watching participants in these types of community? Do you want to answer that? I mean, it's your exploded number. Is the
I didn't read the comments, so you carry on.
Oh, so very, very simply, Tim, you generally look at a lurking ratio of about 10 to 1. We found some evidence that we're looking at more like 93 to 95 to 5 or 7. So essentially, if we have a meaningful community of people who are interacting at, let's say it's 150, you could realistically see a total community of around 1,500. That's what we're suggesting from the research. Moving forward, is there one more? There is identity. Oh, blind to me.
We've done some of this.
We have done some of this already. Sorry, I'm jumping back and forth. Essentially.
Please hold.
Oh, somebody's on hold. Could everybody check that they're on mute? Sounds
Yeah,
like
I'll sort that out, but we can still hear you fine, so don't worry.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, I didn't realize you were going to cover context collapse earlier, but essentially there's an online identity crisis for people because the concept of context collapse was put forward in 2007 by an American researcher who was looking at the phenomena of people recording onto YouTube and realizing that you're not just recording to the whole world there and then, you're broadcasting to the whole of the future. And as a consequence, the context in which you place and make sense of how you communicate to the world fundamentally collapses. And as Paul touched on earlier, we have multiple different media by which, or social media and media by which we're watching our context collapse, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter being three of the more obvious, YouTube as well. So when I can figure out where my clinician is on holiday and they can do the same for me, and I don't know whether I need to friend them or not, and I don't know if it's appropriate for me to go into the clinic or request a Skype consultation if that's even possible, how do I make sense of my identity, either as patient or clinician, in this this brave new and emerging world of online health communities? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So I think we pause briefly to see if people.
Hi there. Can anyone hear me?
We can hear you, Janet.
Janet, you're on mute at the moment.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Yes,
you now,
Janet.
Janet.
Oh, fantastic. Just going over to Kate to find out what's happening in Twitter. Are you there, Kate?
Morning. I did lose the connection a little bit, but I think it's school holidays isn't good for my internet. So morning, everybody. So we have some great stuff going on in Twitter this morning. We have a couple of questions. Is it okay to feed them to you at the moment, or would you like me to save them until later? So we had a question from Caroline, and I don't know if you're going to be touching on this later in the session, who was asking, will we be going into the downsides of online community? And I think that was really focusing on the fact that it's lack of investment, possibly. But I was just wondering if you're going to be going into that later in the session. Ben and Paul? And there is another question as well, which has been fed from a different Caroline, who wants to know, will we be looking at how to support the development of online communities? What actively can we do to help the development of online communities? So, but we've had lots of interest. People love the analogy of the unicorn, and lots of people wish that we could have the unicorn icon on in the chat room, and yeah, it's been done lots of discussion today around the barriers that people face in developing online communities. So thank you very much. I don't know if Paul and Ben would like to think about those questions at all.
Hi, Paul and Ben. Is there any response to those questions?
I think, Paul, you're possibly on mute. Or Ben. Hello.
Hello, Paul and Ben. Are you there?
Hi, Paul. You're back off mute.
Morning, Paul and Ben. You're muted through the WebEx itself, if you look to the right of your name, you'll see your red microphone icons lit. If you click on that to unmute yourself, we'll be able to hear you again.
In the meantime, the question really was around how can we support the development of more online communities. So if you've got any further questions for Ben, please just mention them in the chat room or go into Twitter and put them on the Twitter hashtag. That'd be really helpful.
And Paul and Ben have just put on, they've got an issue with their audio, so I don't know if they could try one or the other because they're both connected. I think what's really interested me this morning was the discussions that are happening about how we can support the development of online communities and, you know, what areas could we develop. And I don't know if people kind of, what your experiences, have you been involved in online communities? Tell us about it in the chat box. And, you know, have you got any top tips that you could give each other today in the own development of online communities? So I think that would be really helpful. That's all part of the great thing about the learning at Edge Talks.
Yeah, absolutely, Kate. And I'm also thinking that what about the costs related to this in terms of time, capacity, and actual financial costs? What's your views on that? How can we get some support? Is it all gifted, or are there grants out there to help you start an online platform? Or is it around connecting with what's already out there? So give us your opinions and your perspectives. Make a contribution on the chat room, and we can feed that back into Ben.
Hi Ben, are you back with us?
Yeah, apologies, for some reason our computer's melted down, and it's
don't worry.
So Fox computers. So hopefully this will work good. You could summarise a couple of the comments, and we could respond. Really.
Yeah, sorry, Kate.
Go on, Janet, you go.
Yeah, one of the comments was around how do we develop online communities? What's the sort of step-by-step guide, if you like, into how to do that? And another question I had was around what are some of the costs to doing some of this? Are there grants available? Are people available that could offer expertise to individuals who wanted to set up their own online community?
Sure.
And costs.
Okay, so to take the costs, I don't think there are any. I think what we're saying is that the standard kind of VC route doesn't work, and the grant giving route often is a way that organisations get started. But that if you're going to manage trust and values and money, you have to have a business model which supports those. And that ultimately just getting grants doesn't do it because you don't get market signals back. And if you don't get it right, then people, and this is repeatedly came from the evidence, that when somebody started, quotes, making money from an online forum, trust immediately broke down and the communities tended to disintegrate. So it's really important to think about money. We had some ideas about meta capital.
We'll come on to later on.
Which we'll come on to, which is rather so that you're looking for capital and investment, not to build the TripAdvisor for health, but to solve some of these surrounding problems about how you build trust, how you educate clinicians to be online with patients and vice versa in ways that are productive. So I think that sort of meta level of solution finding, which is something obviously that NHS IQ is very close to it in terms of the sort of work that you do, is really important.
Well, so I mean, a couple of things on that is that what we heard again and again, and actually in other projects I've been doing, not health related, but with a similar bent towards thinking about how online works, is people clamour for what we need is a TripAdvisor for, or it's the Uber for, and essentially there be dragons. If you think about Paul's points around how technology is exponentially increasing in terms of access and exponentially reducing in terms of cost, that relates to software as well as hardware. So anything that I need to build now will be a fraction of the cost in a year's time or 2 years' time. As a consequence, if we put a lot of money into building a platform, it'll be outdated as soon as it's launched or shortly after. So there be dragons around trying to think about things in terms of TripAdvisor or Uber for a variety of reasons. Generally, it seems to make sense to think about things from a user-centered point of view in terms of where you start. So we found a number of very successful online communities that are just using Twitter or Facebook. Zero cost, immediate start, immediate results. And the sort of the center of that user-centered design piece is thinking about what the intrinsic motivation of the individual is.
So which takes us a little bit on to the next section. Are there other things we need to talk about from the chat room before we do that?
Yes, just looking at the chat room at the moment and seeing what's going on there. I think people are really just tuning in and listening and really enjoying the conversation. So not many questions at the moment, but I will keep you posted if any burning questions do arise.
Great. Well, let's crack on with design principles. So design principles are really the synthesis of many solutions. So from the 70 people that we interviewed, these were the clusters, the strongest and biggest clusters of solutions that people were using again and again, so that they become principles by which we can design online health communities.
So part of it comes on to your question, Helen, about how do we kind of a step-by-step guide to all this. These communities begin with almost always an inspired individual, often a patient, but quite often a clinician, and supporting them and identifying them and helping them find the right business model that manages that trilemma between trust, values, and money is really important. At the same time, I think that because of the kind of things that when big hierarchical organizations come in, they disable these communities. So it's really hard for NHS England to do this stuff. It's really hard for a trust to do this stuff, because immediately the communities say, well, hang on, why are you doing it? What's happening here? Why do we need you? Why can't we go on as we were, just as a community of individuals? And the answer is because that's not sustainable, and somewhere you need a business model. But the business models that come in from NHS England or from venture capitalists don't said. So finding inspired individuals and actually helping and supporting them through this is part of what needs to happen.
Well, what we also said onto that, so an inspired individual on their own is fine, but that inspired individual needs some kind of infrastructure around them. They can only get so far on their own.
So if we just move on, and we've done most of the next one, so we'll go on to the next one. Just to put this on, Ben. Thanks.
One beyond that,
yeah,
okay.
Because we've done that one.
Sure.
To motivation. This is really the question is, how do you bake internal motivation in whilst running a business that generates enough money to survive? I mean, Wikipedia does this. It has 3,000 or so volunteers who do 90% of the curation of Wikipedia. And they have the Wikipedia Foundation, which raises $5 or $10 million a year, and Jimmy Wales is running all that. If Jimmy Wales was running an organization and himself making $50 million a year, nobody would give their time. So we know that you can do it through things like Wikipedia, and it isn't surprising that it's difficult, because this is a really new type of organization, one that runs on internal motivation, on a gift economy where people are giving stuff for free, but also has to make its way in the financial world enough to pay the people who are dedicated at it to pay their salaries and their mortgages and the rest. And I think that in terms of all that, the part of from the user's end, we need to be aiming to always give a sense of altruism fulfilled, together with complete transparency about how the money's being handled. And together those two things, so that users, when they give a comment back about a hospital, or they support somebody who's just been diagnosed with the diagnosis they received 6 months before, feels that they've really done something worthwhile, that their gift has been appreciated, and that somebody is somewhere making enough money to run the business, but that's done in a transparent way, and it's not almost certainly not for profit in a way that, in a lay sense.
So, I mean, I hope you guys are starting to get a sense of what we've uncovered, which is this highly interwoven set of complex issues where there's no right or wrong answer. We need to balance the need to find the resource to build and sustain the community with the right mechanisms by which intrinsic motivation is nurtured and supported and sustained, with the specificity of disease, of geography, of social and cultural difference. So, you know, to the point, the question that was asked is how do you start step by step to develop this? My feeling would be, you know, we're steeped in this now, is to try and understand these dilemmas, trilemmas, quadrilemmas, whatever they are, stand in them long enough to realize that whatever decision or course of action one takes in developing these is going to be problematic. And it's just, I'm going to just briefly go back one slide, which is one of our key findings was build on it being an honest broker, aware of these challenges, these tensions, these paradoxes. We spotted as a critical piece. So Paul did a really amazing job of being that honest broker with patient opinion, and it's led to some quite remarkable things. And it stood the test of time over many public and not-for-profit and private startups, essentially because of that honest brokerage and awareness of the tensions. Do you want to say something more on this? Or should we move on?
Yeah, so I think there are some quite simple things that you can really think about. I think one of them is closing the loop, routinely closing the loop. So, for example, on patient opinion, when you click on a story, you can see the activity associated with the story, so that you can see who's read the story. That means who patient opinion has sent the email to, and it's been opened. And you'll see, you know, if you look at some stories, there'll be 30 or 40 individuals across the NHS, social care, and in Scotland, for instance, quite a few members of the Scottish Parliament will have read stories. And simply by adding that stuff in, you increase the internal motivation, you increase the gift back to the author and the person who's doing the giving, you increase the pressure on organisations to actually participate on these platforms. So closing the loop would be a really important part of all this. And I think that another one would be involving clinicians in ways that surprise them really. So yes, clinicians do jump in and get involved on patient forums, but that's quite transgressive for both sides. There's kind of a frisson goes through the community when that happens. So try and think about ways in which you can involve clinicians in other ways. So UMotif, which does platforms around long-term conditions, has a current program called 100 FP, which is 100,000 people for Parkinsonism, which involves downloading an app, just anybody, whether you've got Parkinsonism or not, and the app allows you to log your movements and log how you're doing each day, and that creates a database for clinicians of 100,000 people that has data about normal movement, normal gait, and suddenly you find clinicians becoming interested in that because it's a new research resource, and so you begin to pull clinicians in that way. And I'm sure, again, the EDGE community has lots of examples of that kind of thing, where you're engaging clinicians in new and exciting ways rather than just expecting them to be a rather naked participant, as it feels as a clinician, in a forum.
Okay. So our last design principle was the idea that you build architecture for emergence. So again, this speaks to what's the step-by-step way in which you develop an online community. Well, one way certainly not to do it is to build something and in such a way that the architecture is rigid and doesn't flex to the needs, desires, and motivations of the individual users. And so specific around that is this idea of forking, which links into clustered scaling, where when groups get to a certain size and the difference of interest in that group is such is at such a level, they end up splitting into different elements or different subgroups. So ensuring that the architecture actually allows and enables that level of emergence, rather than attempting in the way of the venture capitalists dreaming of the unicorns without getting skewered in the eye. Maybe it's venture capitalists that get skewered in the eye. But that is, yeah. So essentially, it's just a way to build in that emergence into the architecture.
And I think it's the desire of the NHS to control these communities, which is at one level very understandable, is it's really hard for the NHS to do this, I think. So I think that comes again back to the need to build honest brokers and to support honest brokers in ways that the NHS might feel slightly uncomfortable about because they don't control it. Mm. Stuff might be said or might happen which they don't control. Yes, they don't control it, but if they don't join that dance in a flexible way and they keep trying to wrestle it to the ground so that it's theirs, the communities will just evaporate around them.
So that's it for design principles. We could take a pause now if there's stuff that we want to chat about, or we could go on to what we see as opportunities.
There's a couple of things coming up that's come up in the chat room. Could you take that now?
Sure.
One of the things is the crossover between identity and condition in setting up an online community. Is it the case that for online communities, people will go to an area, a space where they can connect with others who have a similar identity or condition? Or does it really matter? Do you think?
I think what people need, and if you talk to people who've been on with a lot of experience as patients, of people with long-term conditions, they need the granularity. They need the Twitter that gets to lots of people who've never heard that there's a support group for their condition, the big kind of open stuff. They need the medium-sized group, as Ben was talking about, where people can just kind of find out, well, what are the key things and what does this drug do and all that stuff. And then they need the fine-grained granulation, which is often not at all visible, which is just for them, where they talk amongst a very selected group of their peers. And it's much more important to build that architecture in that allows that, and for the organization to feel easy with it. There was a really interesting interviewee who runs a site for young people with severe illness, and they were faced with a group of their users wanting to set up a subgroup because one of their members was dying, and they wanted to have a group where they could talk about this. And this was in a closed Facebook group, so it was closed anyway, but within the community they wanted to set up an even smaller one. And the organisers were saying, but how can we run this, and how can we see what's happening, and won't this mean that everybody splits? But actually they went with it, and that's exactly what they should have done, because that's what the community needed. So having a system managers for these communities and these platforms who are comfortable with allowing that to happen and allowing communities to split and get to the level of size that they need to supply the intimacy that they need is what's really important.
There's quite a lot of assumption, implied or implicit assumption, that when you build an online community, you need to be all things to all people. And the reality is, I have an identity, I have a condition. I go to multiple different places for my identity to be serviced and engage with it, and I go to multiple different places for my condition. And the best person to decide the assemblage of parts that make up my online engagements around identity and condition is me.
And another thing is, you talked a little bit about trust, values, and money, and that's a very difficult combination, those three. I think they're absolutely important, but have I missed you?
You got to very important.
Right, yeah, that's a very important combination. How do we get to achieve that? How do we achieve that combination, that alignment between trust, values, and money when we want to set up something like this, an online health community?
It's a really great question, and I don't think we should beat ourselves up because we don't know the solution, because these are problems that have only just in the last 15 years become possible. So for myself, within my experience of running patient opinion for 10 years, originally we thought that the NHS would pay for this. And in fact, it turned out that they didn't. They thought we were just going to beat them up with lots of comments from hospitals. And why should we pay for that? And eventually we came to a classic free and premium model that you often find in the web, where everybody gets the stuff for free. But then if you want extra services like reporting, like support in answering difficult questions, in training, you pay for that. And about 10% of the organizations who use patient opinion actually go on to pay for the all the extra services, and that's what keeps patient opinion going. So it's very much horses for courses as to the business model. Can you hear me? Is that working?
That's absolutely fine.
Yeah. So I think if you go to on the one of the slides that has the triangle and go to the resources there, you'll find a list of all the possible business models that we identified from our interviewees that either they were using or that could be used to support this kind of thing. And they'll have different benefits depending on what you're trying to do, but it's always a question of keeping your the money and the trust. That's a really difficult one to do in this new age, because that's a clash between external motivation, money, and internal motivation, trust.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting and important. It's a really 21st century generic task for us to understand in different contexts how we manage that clash between money and trust.
And I suppose that brings me on to the next point, which is how can we engage NHS managers to get on board with the use of online communities?
Well, we're having a go at that with one NHS trust in London at the moment, just one team, and we'll let you know if we manage
who asked for help on a specific question. I think if we go on to if we go on to the next one, I think this one, next slide coming up here.
Yeah. So if we that's a good question to transition to our next slide. Is that okay? Or
okay, that's fine. That's absolutely fine.
Or pause, if there's more, pause us after this slide and we can keep going.
Will do. Will do.
So this diagram brings a lot of what we were thinking together, and I think it does help. It helps people running platforms, but it also helps NHS managers in your question. And what you've got down the vertical side is a site where you feel that it's mainly transactional. The DVLA site, where you go to renew your road tax, is entirely transactional, very efficient. Okay. Down the bottom, the horizontal side, you've got feelings about a site that are mainly relational. So that would be a forum where you've suddenly realized that you're not the only person with Niemann-Pick disease, and that you can actually do something about it, and you feel incredibly emotional about it, at least for a while, because suddenly you found you're not alone. And that the sites that are transactional, the upper left-hand quadrant in blue, are emotionally cool, and they scale, importantly. So the DVLA one has no emotion in it, but is entirely scalable. And they're typically one-to-many, so there's one site and many people coming in to have things done, and they're organizationally focused. Down at the other end, on the red lettering, you've got sites that are emotionally warm, they're peer-to-peer, they're anarchic, and they're limited by the Dunbar number. And in between, there's almost nothing. Actually, there's very, very few sites that mix and match these between. Patient Opinion did a little, TripAdvisor does a little, but it's really hard to think of organizations that lie between the blue kind of quadrant and the red quadrant. And what I think you have to do, this was a slide of AUK stands for Ask Me UK, because I'm a trustee there, so this was me thinking with them about how we could adapt some of this into their work of going digital. And I think what you need and what managers need to understand is that you have a scalable transactional site, like, for instance, a trust website in blue, and then you have an online community where it's red, and you need stories that take people from one to the other routinely. So what might take the user from the scalable transactional site to the emotional one? So that might be an introduction to the emotional one, saying, you know, you might like to see stories about people who are about to undergo renal transplantation. Here it is. And then what might take stakeholders what might take them back the other way, so that you actually get back. So that way you manage some of the small, emotional, warm stuff that doesn't scale with the big scaling stuff that organizations need to make this value for money. And it's about the stories that go back and forth, that take people back and forth on that user journey. Ben?
Yeah, so this is, I remember Paul working this slide up for an AUK board meeting or working group and sending it over to me and saying, so what's in the middle? What do we create that's in the middle? And my response was, well, I'm not sure that anything sits in the middle. It's about the user journey. And I think it's a very useful concept to think about journey as opposed to product. Because when we think about online health communities, we're effectively building a product. But when we think about journey, we're thinking about the route that somebody takes to get to a particular location that could go any number of ways. And how do we support them in being best equipped for that journey? It's a very different mindset in terms of thinking about building, developing, or nurturing online functionality.
And I think when we came to this research, and I certainly thought that the red stuff was going to drive all this, and that's where the really important stuff happens, and it is at a patient level and at a kind of learning level. That's where individual transformation takes place on these sites. So people suddenly realise what's happening, or clinicians suddenly see how they're perceived as patients, or whatever. But you definitely need the other side as well in order to get the scale as well as the intimacy. And you can't get them on, we don't think, on a single site. That's why there's nothing much in the middle. And we've concentrated either on forums and community sites or on organizational websites, and we need to think very creatively. And I think there's a lot that can be done to do that. We haven't done it, not that the solutions are difficult, about how you build that user journey that takes people from the scalable, cool information site to the warm, intense learning site and back again.
Okay. Should we crack on with the opportunities? I think so. So that's really a transition slide, and it was one of these aha moments during the research. And we thought it's not really a design principle, it's not an opportunity, it's more a way of being. We're still figuring that one out to some degree. Is this you or me?
So excuse me. I think at this stage of the development of the field, it's really important that we support, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, pluralism of business models, pluralism of technical architectures, and pluralism of design solutions that accommodate difference. I guess this is aimed at, really, at least in part in my head, if I'm completely honest, people like NHS England, who understandably think that if we throw enough money at it from the top of the hierarchy, we surely must be able to solve this. And I think it's really hard. Their position at the top of the hierarchy positively disables them, and nobody knows the solution. We need to support plurality and diversity in order to find out what works in this space. But that also comes on to the next one, which is about financing. And we come back to, it's not about throwing loads of money in order to find the next unicorn or to build the next NHS Choices site. It's about meta capital and the kind of meta level solutions. How do we define a set of governance rules that work across lots of these? How do we educate people about the kind of issues we've been talking to?
So the reference point that got us thinking about this was Apple's research kit. It's not quite a meta architectural intervention, but it's close, because research kit essentially allows you to build apps which then do health and now care research, so you can gather data. What it actually is a proprietorial play, so that anybody in the health world has to use an iPhone rather than an Android or any other phone. But it got us thinking that actually what the venture capitalists and all the money is doing is trying to find the next unicorn that's going to exponentially grow, whereas actually the smart money needs to go into architecture that supports a myriad of different pluralist, clustered, small-scale intimate online health communities to develop, so that over time the right set of functionality, online communities, platforms, journeys can develop. Meta capital doesn't need to be big. It might be big. It's about what people are expecting back from it. It's not an exponential return. It's an exponential growth in functionality and options for people building online health communities.
That's Ben's past experience as a social capital innovator coming through.
Don't call me a social capitalist.
So let's skip over the next one because we've done that one. We've done the
first game. We've done. Big deal though, really big deal.
So I think that,
to wrap up,
this is our last slide, and it's really, I think that there's a kind of a first within the NHS for new stories about change, and that sounds trite, but people know and understand the uses and the pros and cons of KPIs, of financial incentives, of quasi-markets, of sticks and carrots, and those things simply don't work. They often don't work much in the NHS, but they certainly don't work in online communities. So part of what I think is needed is a different set of stories about change and how change happens, and how does it happen in this chaotic peer-to-peer world of online communities. And the kind of stories that we came up with is that there's a very interesting set of conversations going on around saying that what you need is entanglement. You need to entangle people with each other, not to get them joined on a program with a clear policy end, which is aimed for A, B, C, and D, but actually the growth and the learning comes from being entangled, of clinicians being entangled in this new world with patients in this new world, and both together learning. So that was one. And another one is that I think will ultimately have a huge effect on medicine, but which is not being heard at all at the moment, is the hard science coming out of what's known as the Eco-Evo-Devo revolution: ecology, evolution, and evolutionary development, the development of organisms. And that's about the very hard science about how symbiosis is much more important than competition, about how it's about networks, about how things become together rather than are instructed to be differently. So I think there's a whole set of scientific metaphors which are in the wings, which will be really helpful in this field once the scientists begin to recognize them, because then you'll be coming to this with scientists who've grown up with these new understandings that the world is not an objective truth out there, it is a co-becoming. And that's true of genetic networks, of protein networks, of cellular networks, of organismal networks, and of ecological networks. So I think there's some interesting new change stories that we need.
So that's us. That's the project website. Those are our contact details. We this week I submitted the final reports to both the Health Foundation and Guys and St Tommy's Charity. So huge thanks to both of those organisations. We still have a bit of mileage on the clock to get through. We're supporting a small number of organisations to, yeah, chat's just there. We're supporting a small number of organisations to think about how they apply these findings into their development of online health communities. We're doing a series of blogs and articles. There's one on Paul's site, 21st Century Healthcare, went up earlier this week. There's one on the Guys and St Tommy's website. We're hoping to get into the Guardian and a few other places. And we're thinking through with both Guys and Tommy's and Health Foundation about how we might take this forward. Do we run a staff college? Do we provide some kind of advisory service? Do we just keep prodding from the outside? Who knows? I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about the work, and also your thoughts about how we might configure what we're doing to best assist people looking to develop online health communities.
Thank you, Paul and Ben. That's been fantastic. We've got some questions in the chat room. Is it okay to ask that now?
Absolutely, yeah, go ahead. I was just looking at them.
Yeah, there's one that Sarah's asked, which is really around online privacy. So if you have health professionals coming on and sharing their stories, how can we assure those participants, those clinicians or the staff, that their privacy is going to be respected and that it's a safe space to share?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is. Thank you, Sarah, for putting your comments up there. I think. I mean, this is in our view, I think it's a subset of the problem in the social world at large. How do you manage your online identity? And there's a really, on the resources page of our website, there's a reference to a book by Aaron Balick, who's a psychotherapist, about psychotherapy in an online world, which I think might be really helpful to you, Sarah, or to other people interested from a clinician point of view about how to manage that. He's talking as a psychotherapist about the effect of online work where people can see his profile and he can see their profile, and they suddenly discovered stuff about him that he would never have disclosed as a psychotherapist. And I think that's so that I would say go there and have a look at Aaron Balick's book. And it's not straightforward. You're not alone in this, but I the kind of generic solution is to have those discussions in an entirely anonymous form. So you set up a different online persona that never the twain will meet with your real, as it were, persona, or you reveal online the stuff that you're comfortable with not, and accept that if you reveal anything, it's quite likely that people, if they want to, can dig and find out a lot more about you, and that might be uncomfortable. But there are no easy solutions here, I quite agree.
Sorry, that was me typing, Joe, just getting the link to Aaron Balick's The Psychodynamics of Social Networks. I'll try and stop myself typing.
No worries, thank you.
There's some important contributions throughout the chat room, and Kate, you're on standby for what's happening on Twitter. But just before you come in, there's something around open sourcing, and how important is that to online communities?
Well, so what do you mean in terms of open sourcing? So the code?
Providing information free, I think.
Well, yeah, so I mean, so that's very interesting, isn't it? So Paul will be able to tell you about patient opinion and how important it is to keep the comments open. But then you talk to a lot of the groups that we've talked to, and actually privacy is an incredibly important driver. You know, it's not like TripAdvisor where you comment, where you want everybody to know you've had a bad experience in a hotel. When you've had you know, a positive or negative experience around a condition that is a fundamentally private thing, you want your mum, your dad, your partner, and the clinician to know.
I also think in terms of the question of open sourcing data and for research and people who are volunteering their data, their Fitbit data or their biosensor data, what do they feel about that going ultimately to make far more money? And so that's a different aspect of online, which is, again, I think, changing very rapidly. So somewhere in all this, it's likely in the next few years that blockchain, the new technology that underlies Bitcoin, will play a part. There was a very interesting paper just in the last couple of weeks from a GP in Cambridge, whose name just escapes me, talking about how you could use blockchain to allow people to give their data to research programs in much more secure ways that would include them in fundamentally as an equal partner in that. And it's also interesting to think that Estonia now has all its medical records, all its electronic health records is underpinned by blockchain. So there are some new bits here around not just is the technology open source, not just is the forum open, but is the actual data handling and the contract between me as a citizen and the state providing healthcare or the organization to do research is likely to change fundamentally because of blockchain.
Yeah, but I mean, we've had these conversations about blockchain, right? And it actually fits in terms of the transactional relational, in that blockchain has the potential on a transactional basis to really do some quite interesting stuff. But at a relational level, the idea that blockchain as a mechanism to quantify trust is going to be useful, I think, is fundamentally problematic, because trust by its very nature is an intimate experience and not something to put into a ledger. Really interesting set of questions.
Anything else from the chat room that
Yes, thank you,
Shall
Kate.
I
Take us to the Twitter room.
Yes, there's been lots of listening, I think, going on today. So the Twitter's gone a bit quiet again, but I think it's because it's such a fascinating subject. So there were just there was a few questions, and if I start with the first, which I think you perhaps got cut out on earlier, it's like, what practical steps can we actually do to develop online platforms? I just wonder if you had any like tips or guidance that you could actually help to start people off.
And start we being NHS managers.
Well, I think there's a mixture of people on the chat, on the session today, of patients, advocates, managers, clinicians. So it's kind of like, you know, practical guides. If you're that enthusiastic person with a passion to start a platform, what would you suggest is a good starting point?
Okay, well, if I take that from initially the generic NHS manager's point of view, I think the first thing to recognise is that you're probably not the organisation to do it, but you probably are the organisation to facilitate it happen. So I think you would start looking for inspired individuals, both patients and clinicians out there in the area that you wanted to work with, and taking a deep breath and giving them some modest resource and truly giving it to them, to let them and roll with them to see what happens, and try and work to become entangled with them, if you want to use that metaphor, but not control them. And that's going to be uncomfortable, but yes, you can do it, I think. You might find organizations out there who are already trying, and again, that's fundamentally to look, if you're somebody commissioning one of these sites, to look at their values and to look at their business model, and to not think that those two are independent. They are intimately connected. So they may have the greatest technical platform in the world, but if you think their values aren't right, or their business model is going to ultimately depend on scaling enormously, or taking IP in terms of data from you or from patients, then that's a real warning sign. So I think there's some generic kind of, from an NHS manager's point of view, some relatively straightforward things that you can begin to think about that are different and go beyond saying, let's just commission a site to do X, which is where most busy managers start from, and it's probably the wrong place to start.
So I would add to that, as and when you found those people, find some people who aren't inside the NHS and get them to talk with the inspired individuals you found. So Paul would be one from Patient Opinion. Michael Serres, who seems to be pretty well known in this space, would be another. Seb Tucknott, who started IBDrelief.com.
Inflammatory bowel disease relief.
Would be another. People who've actively been that inspired individual, navigated the challenges and built something that is of meaning to other people. Get them sitting down in a room with those inspired individuals. Watch, learn, and get out of the way. That's from a
yeah. And think about the business model from day one. You won't find the right business model from day one, but it's really important to think, who is going to pay for this in 2 years' time?
And sorry, the obvious to me is included in business model is volunteering and intrinsic motivation. So it's not just about where the money comes from, but where's the resource coming from. That's practical steps from a manager's point of view.
I was going to say, I think that kind of like leads into one of our other comments, and that was, what are the downsides of online communities? And, you know, is the funding one of the key downsides, or are there any other things that we should consider?
That's a really good question, and I think there are an obvious one which you touched on, is that we don't think they don't scale. So some of the early promises that they had, or that people had about them, and I certainly had about them, aren't going to deliver. So unless you can navigate the two halves in that slide, the user journey between the emotional and the transactional type of site, you'll be forever replicating small communities which tend to fracture, do a great job, but they're not going to scale that much. They obviously can be quite destructive at times, as we know from other aspects of social media. I don't think it is a problem in health online health communities, but it's rather less of a problem because of the content, and people come to these sites in an altruistic, giving, I've really suffered, I want to help type of mood. I mean, it was startling on Patient Opinion that Patient Opinion stories are all moderated, and we had to remove a racist or obscene comment from only 1 in 6,000 stories. 5,999 weren't moderating from that point of view. People were trying to help the system, trying to help other people with the same thing, trying to make their local hospital better for other people with their condition. So I think there's a huge wellspring of altruism from which, and we should start from that and assume it, rather than necessarily think people are going to automatically turn into trolls and to do terrible things, because that's not representative of much, not all, but most of what happens around online health communities.
Thank you. And I've just got one more question, but I was just putting Helen on standby in case Helen had any further questions that she wanted to ask that she's picked up from the chat room as well. So my final question that comes from Shirley, and it was, you know, we like the concept of the honest brokers, but who are they? How do we identify them? What do we need to look out for?
You talk to them, and you look specifically at that trilemma of money, trust, values. And you don't, obviously, if you ask people about their values, and I do just the same, we all talk about our rhetorical values, which are important, but they're not actually what we do in action. So values in action are what you look at. So you need to look at their track record. What happened if when they've done something previously, if they've already done something online, can you share with me? And then you look at how they've handled difficult interactions online, for instance, is a great way to look at whether they're going to be good people to run the community side of things. And also to ask, the question, a really good question is this for profit or not? Leave aside what you mean for the intricacies of for profitness or not for profitness. But if people are ultimately setting up a site in order to make money, and especially if they're going to set it up in order to try and become a unicorn, to sell on to somebody else to make a lot of money, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it's a very different set of motivations and a very different dance you're going to get into, as opposed to most of the people who you'll find as inspired individuals who, if you would say, if you could get modesty to say, all I want to do is to pay the mortgage and to make sure I don't get burnt out on this, and I want to spend the rest of my life doing it because it's what completely I'm passionate about. And that's the sort of motivational Rubicon that is worth thinking about.
I'd add to that, having some kind of understanding, whatever that is, of that trilemma, an acknowledgement of it, and an interest in engaging and trying to make sense of it, not necessarily finding the solution, because to be honest, I don't think there really is one. Certainly not a single standard.
So I think if I think about a sort of a manager trying to commission a service or running a service across a hospital or a local network, I mean, there is a great tendency, just because of the pressure of time and I've got this money, let's go and ask somebody and we'll go to procurement and they'll build us the site. And if you're going to do that, think about these things first and think about the trust that the community will have, and why should people come to your site when you've built it. Do something small. Use that. You've got to go for pluralistic approaches and do something small and quick and that you learn from, rather than spend all your money on a single site and you build it and nobody comes, or you build it and people come and then they get fundamentally distrustful because you haven't got the motivations right.
That's really helpful, Paul and Ben. I think that, just to add on to that question is the question around sustainability, because that seems to be something that most managers are really keen when they're thinking about patient engagement, around how can we sustain that engagement. And if you're saying, actually, we need to think small first of all and test and pilot and then see where that takes us and then get out of the way, which is about losing that control and losing that, maybe that focus on sustainability. What would you say to a manager who's very concerned about that area?
So the first starting point is to think, I think within 3 months of the Brundtland Commission, coming up with the word sustainable development, there were 62 different definitions of sustainable. So what do we mean by sustainable? Key in our research is this idea of intrinsic motivation, the army of inspired individuals passionate about a particular thing, wanting to make a difference. That's how you, if you're talking financially, that's the main way in which you spin down cost. Now, there will always be some level of cost. How you meet that cost is a really interesting question. And I would like to think that over time, we'll be able to see causal linkages between online health communities and cost savings. And that hopefully somebody inspired, way up at the top, Simon, are you there if you're listening? Way up at the top of the NHS might be able to start to see that and put the research gathering mechanisms in place that build the evidence that say, yes, actually, SEB, IBD relief, it's really clear that for every person who engages with your site, there's a cash cost saving to the NHS of X. And we can make a part of that available because everybody wins. That would be my sort of reductionist view of it, Paul.
I think the other way in terms of keeping patient engagement is to think about it as how do we deliver a sense of altruism fulfilled to as many contributions as we can. So people are wanting to help. Assume that they want to help first, so they're not going to beat you up. And then how do we close that loop so emotionally they feel great? So what they get a reply. I mean, it's at one level, it's a really simple thing like the classic "you said, we did." Closing that "we did" loop is really important. But I think the technology now, the digital technology, allows us to do so much more about that. So that rather than just filling out your friends and family free text comment, that you actually get some feedback about that, and that's public, and that it's summed in some way so that people can see that they're part of a normative social thing that's commenting about the NHS in ways that are productive and generating change. And that will, it's about using the technology to close the loop, to make things more clear about the conversations that are happening, rather than just taking the data and feeding it into the trust dashboard. Which the trust, I completely get it that the trust board needs a dashboard that says, you know, is the cardiovascular ward going up or down in terms of patient satisfaction? But that does absolutely nothing. That just turns the people filling out the comments into widgets. So you've got to close the loop in all sorts of imaginative ways, which are now very low cost to do if you get the technology right.
And the goodwill is there. Paul did a piece of work a little while ago looking at litigation. The NHS Litigation Authority spends way in excess of 800 million a year, I think it is. Mm-hmm. And the vast majority of people who get a cash settlement, that's not their primary motive. They want redress, they want an apology, and they want to know that their complaint has made a difference. So even in such a strong situation as litigation, the overwhelming intention of patients, of users, is to create positive feedback loops.
Can I just ask you both another question quite quickly? In the chat room, people are saying, what's the difference between online and offline engagement? Are there some things that you can do online that actually you can do offline? And what about the sort of emotional and more tactile way of engaging? And and some people have said actually you can have huddles online as a way of emotionally connecting with your audience. What's your view on that?
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a great question. We looked at some areas about, we asked quite a lot of interviewees about whether they used offline as well as online, and offline clearly helped cement the relationships and create the community and help people to move forward. I think that and that's really productive, and you don't need that much. An awful lot of offline meeting goes a long way, and I think the problem from the NHS point of view is often that you meet in the real world around a committee table at 2 o'clock on a Thursday, and it's very boring for patients. That's not what they want. So if you could transform that kind of offline into something that really built trust, and then do the stuff online, which is of course by and large not what the NHS does. It does paper-based surveys or gets data from other things. so that you were then using the online forums where you'd built the offline trust to engage with people. And we Patient Opinion, we tried this several times, and it was remarkable how difficult it was to get the NHS to do this. That would be some new way of mixing offline and online. But the generic answer to your question, I think, is that there's all to play for here. We don't know enough about the right mix, especially we know quite a lot about the mix between patient groups or manager groups or doctor groups. But when you're a manager facilitating a patient group or a patient group with a clinician there, it's really hard to know what the right mix of those two sort of where different categories of people are coming together online and offline. We don't know enough about that.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you so much. I just making a comment here from John. He says the face-to-face is where the online seed can be planted. Question mark there.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And again, face-to-face meetings or support groups or user groups are a great way to feed into the bottom right-hand corner red emotional kind of forum type sites. The question then is, how do you do that enough? Because user groups typically are very small and they're only touching a tiny percentage of a trust's patients with those conditions. And how do you scale those stories of intimacy and what happened to me and how back to the big site and to the big website and to your big services where lots of people are being seen in ways that are useful and supportive? And you know, you can think of lots of ways to do that. A service might use an online forum and a face-to-face user group to build trust and stories, and then take that into leaflets that they distribute out with the link on, or text messages out to people who've just visited their service. You might like to see our digest of what people have said about this drug, or you might like to join our online forum or the Health Unlocked online forum or wherever it is. There's a huge amount of that kind of stuff that we could be doing that we're not.
Well, I mean, in a way, online and offline, if we think of it in a different way and we think of what people engage with as an assemblage of different functions across multiple platforms, some of which happen to be in real life, rather than a single online health community or a single platform. It's a fundamental mind shift that we see as essential to getting this stuff right.
And my final question to you both is around evaluations, because one of the things, if we're going to move towards more online communities, more of this way of engaging with patients, we've got to show the evidence behind that to make the case. Is this another emerging area? Is this another space that's just open for new thinking, new possibilities?
I mean, you can look at this in any number of different ways, right? That actually the ultimate test is whether people are using something. On the one hand, so a sort of a true neoliberal market-based approach to evaluation, and to the other, talking about realizing cost savings, is you need a very clearly tightly coupled system to capture the data from an online health community and to see that it's causally linked to a reduction in costs of service provision. Beyond that, evaluation is... Paul's got something to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some new tools around. There are people doing this. So tools that analyze what people say in terms of sentiment analysis. So they're software tools that scoop up loads and loads of comments and say how angry or how happy or how pleased are these people on average. And that field is moving very fast. And I think clearly there would be some evaluation tools around forums, for instance, that you could use. Certainly we did some of that work around anonymized patient stories on Patient Opinion. It was very interesting. But it's really important that you immediately can see then, if you're doing sentiment analysis on a user group's comments about a particular disease, the potential is a huge potential for people to lose trust. It's big brotherish. People are going, well, how? That doesn't, what are you going to use it for? What are you saying here? That we're all angry or we're all happy or whatever. So how you do that, how you manage those new tools in ways that manage the trust and values is the crucial bit. Not that the tools won't be there. The tools are arriving there, and big data is driving this very fast. But it's really essential, especially within a field like health, which is big enough to define its kind of own normative rules, that we do it in ways that promote the human heart and the intimacy and the values of support and mutuality that lie at the heart of the NHS, and we don't get dragged off down.
Thank you both for that. That's been fantastic. I have to stop you there because we're just over time. I just want to say thank you very much to Paul and Ben. Thank you to our Twitter followers and to all those who participated in the chat room, and to all those who really helped behind the scenes to make this session so fantastic. Our next session is going to be on innovation on the 1st of July, so watch out for that and keep the conversation going on Twitter, and we look forward to seeing you again. Take care, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hello.
Hi, Janet. We'll just have a quick debrief once we've shut down. So we'll just give it a few minutes. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for today. Janet's left. Okay. Okay. I don't know if Paul and Ben are still there.
They've left as well.
They've left.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll just have just give it a few minutes and we'll have a quick debrief. Okay, is that okay? Alison and